Hi, everyone. We are back with another edition of Bad News. I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
All right. Well, as always, we are a project of the Federalist, brought to you also by the National Journalism Center. And we have a big show today because Joe Biden, weeks and weeks and weeks into his presidency, decided to hold his first press conference, went for about an hour yesterday. And Ben and I are here to break it all down. Ben, how about we start with the journalist who's funded by our taxpayer dollars?
She really outdoes herself every time, doesn't she?
She's so reliable, so reliable. Let me play this clip here from Yamiche Alcindor, who got a question at Biden's press conference yesterday. And it's a question for the record books, I think.
Thanks so much, Mr. President. You've said over and over again that immigrants shouldn't come to this country right now. This isn't the time to come. That message is not being received. Instead, the perception of you that got you elected as a moral, decent man is the reason why a lot of immigrants are coming to this country and entrusting you with unaccompanied minors. How do you resolve that tension? And how are you choosing which families can stay and which can go, given the fact that even though with Title 42, there are some families that are staying? Is there a time?
This is the dumbest question ever. First of all, because they're not coming because they see him as like Grandpa Joe. They're coming because they see him as being lenient on immigration. So not only is it just absolutely hilarious that she felt the need to lavish him as praise and saying, listen, you got elected because there's this perception of you as just a moral, decent man. What? What was your reaction to this, Ben?
And she's fawned over President Biden before, so this isn't anything new. And that she was one of the first people to be given the opportunity to ask a question is telling in and of itself, because as we know, the president had this Facebook-like picture chart, and it seemed like maybe some numbers on it indicating who he ought to call on and in what order. So maybe no surprise that she was right near the top of the list. I think what the question exposes is that even the most sycophantic members of our so-called media recognize and concede that he has a disaster on his hands, and America, more importantly, has a disaster on its hands at the southern border. And so the very best they can do is try to make it a consequence of the president being such a great guy. But the reality, of course, is there's an argument to be made that I argue should be made that it's not compassionate at all to have a policy where, first of all, you're allowing our borders to be eroded, our rule of law to be undermined, all of the individuals living in communities on the border and beyond that have to grapple with the consequences. It's obviously not compassionate for them. And it's also not compassionate to create a situation where you end up with these thousands of unaccompanied minors coming in, where you have coyotes and all of the myriad other maladies. Of course, people with coronavirus themselves coming over the border as well, cramping them in then to these facilities here. It's also pretty much in violation of international legal practice as well, in terms of you should stay in the country that you traverse through when you're trying to seek asylum in another place. So we don't even need to go into all of those issues. The fact of the matter is, it was a pathetic question from a sycophant, and this is the best spin that they can put on the issue. Essentially, is what I think the takeaway is you're such a great guy is the best that they can do for a pretext, a rationale for the disaster that happened. And by the way, later in the press conference, the president said, "I make no apologies for my policies that have enabled this border crisis, including the Remain in Mexico policy that I was just alluding to, in terms of the fact that if you're going to make a case for asylum, stay in the country on the other side of the border. Don't rush our borders." So he admits essentially that his policies have created this, yet he blamed it on President Trump, which was really a remarkable turn. And one of the things that we ought to point out is he almost never got called on any of his assertions that just do not stand up to the facts during the press conference. Like, President Trump would get attacked on everything. Even when he had a fact, he would get attacked on the facts that he put forth. President Biden makes assertions, including he said that President Trump allowed people to starve to death on the other side of the border. And he doesn't even miss a beat. He just continues right on. And of course, there's no prodding or probing. And immigration, incidentally, was the place where maybe Biden took the toughest questions, so-called. But essentially, the questions were look, this is a humanitarian crisis. Can you speed this up by essentially giving all these people amnesty? That was the underlying implication of the remarks. And that was sort of the running theme throughout the entire press conference was, okay, your policies are good, but you need to move faster and like erode the filibuster if you have to. Do whatever it takes to get it done. So the main critique, I guess, from the press, well, there was sort of you need to move faster to get done the agenda that we all share. And then the other critique was you're just not left enough yet. So get there.
Well, and I think part of this is it's easy for us to fall into the habit, and not us, but it's easy for people to sort of fall into the habit of grading the media on a curve. And I think Biden gets graded on a curve by the media, but then I also think it's easy to sort of grade the media on a curve because it's like we're so used to how corrupt and terrible at their jobs that they are. But it's so funny because there's this contradiction in how Biden responded to Yamisha's question, which was to say, well, I hope that's the case. And then later in the press conference, list all of these reasons that have nothing to do with him, why the migrants are coming to the border. So you cannot have it both ways. And a better press would have called him out on that contradiction. And he had contradictions throughout the press conference that the reporters didn't call him out on. And yes, part of that is because they're coming with planned questions, et cetera, et cetera. But like, how about, and we'll get to this question in a bit, but he was asked about whether he thinks the filibuster is a relic of Jim Crow. How about you ask him to explain the dissonance between his inaugural address about unity and coming together and calling voter ID laws Jim Eagle? I mean, it's like mind numbing. And not only did the press frame questions in a way sort of similar to what Yamiche Alcindor did there, which I really think is one for the books. Basically, the perception of you is so nice, is so good that these migrants are just coming to you for protection, which is not at all what's happening. They're coming because of Biden, but they're not coming because they see this warm, gentle, friendly man. That couldn't be like further from the truth. And yet she embedded it in a question at his first press conference. In fact, she got the first question in his first press conference, I believe. Or no, she wasn't the first. AP was the first, but one of the first questions. And I thought it really set the tone. And it was just like, it's also just a matter of selection bias, right? So it's not just that their questions are biased, it's what they choose to ask and how they choose to ask it that omits certain things that I think is like omits the sort of glaring discrepancy between a president who pledges unity and then calls Republican voter ID laws or Republican voting reform Jim Eagle and compares it to Jim Crow at all. I mean, that's just disgusting. It's so disgusting. It's such a disgusting insult. It reminds me of the piece that I wrote before the inauguration, which is that there's no way Joe Biden can bring the country together because he perpetuates the idea that you're either a progressive or you're a bigot. And that's exactly what we see. But you get no questions from the press for that because there's nobody in the press that represents the average Americans who are sitting around thinking, this guy, like, really? This is unity? Because I think I want a voter ID law. I'm not like a hard Republican, but I think I want a voter ID law. I don't think I'm racist. And there's nobody in the media that's willing to say, listen, we need to think about this. Like, can you actually explain it? So with that, do you have any final thoughts on Yamisha's question or any of the other softballs that Biden had the opportunity to knock out of the park? But
I mean, there's so much to work with here, but like, I think that we should have level set by saying, you talked about the media doing such a bad job. I don't know if from their perspective, they think they did a bad job. They certainly did a bad job for the American people when there are myriad questions that could be asked about all of these hugely consequential issues that could be asked in a very straightforward, non-hysterical manner. But I think the media did their job in the sense that he didn't completely stumble all over himself, even though there were some times, like he said, for example, that he came into the Senate 120 years ago, and he wasn't being self-deprecating there. He actually said it without pause or laughing or chuckling or anything like that. He also got caught up another time in a really cringeworthy clip where he's talking about how to deal with difficult issues, and he just fell all over himself with that, and it's painful to watch, actually. But I think from their perspective, they feel like we got him through this press conference. He didn't completely make a fool of himself, but it's clear that he's lost well over a step. And the fact that he had cheat sheets there the whole time, which we didn't even talk about, you talk about the reporters having the planned questions. He had planned answers, and that's unheard of. If you look at the Trump press conferences, everything was completely freewheeling. Clearly, the media had an agenda. They attacked him. They savaged him. You never got an analogous question on the other side of the coin of like the Jim Crow relic regarding the filibuster. Like President Trump, do you believe that the Democrats are open borders because they want to have a permanent majority in the country and they think that ultimately an amnesty will get them that permanent majority? Do you think he would ever get a question anything like that? Of course not. And I think the perfect sort of juxtaposition here is you were talking about the first question that was asked. The first question that came in this press conference concluded with, and I'm going to quote here, "How far are you willing to go to achieve these promises that you made to the American people?" And that's regarding so-called voting rights. It's regarding climate change, and I believe maybe infrastructure and several of these other issues. I went back and I looked at the transcript from the first President Trump press conference, which was February 16th. So Joe Biden's was March 25th. The president's was February 16th. What was the first question to President Trump? It was, did you fire Michael Flynn? That was the first question. And then that led to a whole series of questions about General Flynn and Russiagate repeatedly. Essentially, he was asked at least 3, 4, 5 times, did anyone in your campaign have any contacts with the Russians? Over and over again. So the juxtaposition there could not be more striking. In the one case, it was Russia, Russia, Russia. In the other case, it was, we love your agenda, but you need to make it move faster. Can you please make it move faster, Mr. President? Get rid of the filibuster. It's a Jim Crow relic. Because it's racist, we have to erode it, and then you can ram through your agenda. That was the subtext of the whole thing.
Well, something we also never talk about, again, not us, but something that gets in, it's admittedly sort of difficult to talk about, but it's something that you also brought up in the way that like it's very uncomfortable and difficult to watch Joe Biden sometimes because he stumbles, he sort of fails to complete his thoughts, or his thoughts are clearly jumbled. And again, like it's uncomfortable, but the media's reaction to Joe Biden's speech was just sort of typical of what we've seen, where it's like you're just grading him on a curve, right? Joe Biden got through an entire hour without saying anything that, or like without, having a breakdown on television. Therefore, not only was it fine, he's, the fittest president that we've ever had, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think by reacting to it that way, they're also doing a disservice because it's not really accurate. It's not how they would describe a Republican president, but it's also just not an accurate depiction of what happened. I mean, he was Joe Biden. He was sort of like struggling to get through his thoughts. And, I think there's one of our commenters here put a quote from Ben Shapiro up. I'm going to put it up here. "The gap between the media coverage of Biden's presser and Biden's actual performance demonstrates that our establishment media are just the Democratic Party propaganda wing." And again, Ben, we've talked about this before. It's not that the Democratic Party propaganda wing, even though that's sort of downstream of it, they're leftists. They're leftists, and the sort of marriage of their leftism with their business interests creates some really interesting results. But yeah, there was totally a gap between how the media said, "Wow, finally, like we have normalcy and maturity back," and that Biden was cagey as a politician often is, and he didn't really answer questions. He came in. It's not abnormal for presidents to come with a list of the reporters they're going to call on and their names and everything, but this man hasn't done a press conference in however many times. He didn't call on anybody that wasn't pre-planned. So it was just like, this is not a cool, normal accomplishment. It's only normal in the bad sense that we're used to our politicians not answering any of our damn questions. And we're used to those questions being sort of milquetoast when that politician happens to be a Democrat. So like, yay, normalcy has returned.
Yeah, normalcy returns. That is, the ruling class gets to ram its agenda through. The media runs interference for them. Imagine what the headlines would have been. I know we're going to play this game every single week, but imagine what the headlines would have been in a Trump scenario. Amid border crisis and resurgence of coronavirus cases in the already hardest hit states, president shows declining mental acuity and needs cheat sheets to get through a press conference. I mean, and that's not an exaggeration. That would be like the soft version of the way they portrayed what happened yesterday. So it's embarrassing, but for them, they're all probably patting each other on the back because they're helping present the appearance of sort of a legitimate kind of presidency, when in reality, I mean, what seems deeply disturbing about it is that you wonder who's really writing the agenda, because this is not consistent with what the Biden agenda was throughout his entire career, essentially. Does he really believe the stuff that's being fed into the teleprompter and put on the cards in front of him? I'm sure he's just happy to be the president of the United States, and that's the reality of it. But
just happy to be here.
Just happy to be there. But it's disturbing to watch it, and it's sort of like the machine is on autopilot, and it doesn't really matter who actually is the face of the administration, but he is the perfect face because it's the seemingly kindly, although like you said, he's cagey, and he even did strike back a couple of times when there was a question, for example, about is it acceptable that children are waiting at the border and separated from their parents, and he's like, come on, man. Of course he gave that sort of answer to it. So God forbid you get close to getting under his skin with a question, but he's the perfect front man to ram through what I think objectively is the most radical agenda that we've ever had in the history of the country.
Yeah, and I'm going to roll clip number 2 because this is a really good segue.
Regarding the filibuster, at John Lewis's funeral, President Barack Obama said he believed the filibuster was a relic of the Jim Crow era. Do you agree?
Yes.
If not, why not abolish it if it's a relic of the Jim Crow era?
Successful electoral politics is the art of the possible. Let's figure out how we can get this done and move in the direction of significantly changing the abuse of even the filibuster rule first. It's been abused from the time it came into being by an extreme way in the last 20 years. Let's deal with the abuse first.
You're moving closer to eliminating the filibuster. Is that correct?
I answered your question.
Oh my gosh, the pause that he took when Caitlin pinned him down on, and that was, by the way, Caitlin Collins of CNN, when she pinned him down on saying, if you believe that it is a relic of the Jim Crow South, why do you not believe that we should abolish it? And the reason I think we want to talk about this clip is because it gets at something that we cover a lot on the show, which is that the media has this sort of performative reflex where now that it's the Biden administration after the Trump administration, you saw some of this in the Obama administration, like from Jim Acosta. They want to prove that they are covering you without fear or favor. Now it's like it's their time to shine and say, we're going to really like cover, and they're going to get accolades, right? They're going to get accolades for asking some of these tough questions from Biden. I don't think this will be the last time we particularly see this from Caitlin Collins of CNN, who was very sharp towards Trump, and I think often unfair, but I expect her to be somebody who asks a lot of good questions of Joe Biden because I don't think she's a leftist. But that's sort of how this happens, right? That like they're going to throw in some of these questions that really do get Biden. And oh my gosh, what a perfect answer to talk about what we just talked about, which is how he stumbled and it was just painful to watch. That pause that he took after the question, I was like, please say something. Please just say anything. Open your mouth, do something. It was hard to watch. And so again, this gets to the Shapiro point about the gulf between what happened and the media coverage. But yes, they're going to pepper Joe Biden with difficult questions every now and then pat themselves on the back for being Woodward and Bernstein and being tough reporters covering the, democracy is going to die in darkness if they don't cover people without fear or favor. Did you have a similar reaction to this, or am I sort of like out in left field?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I see it, first of all, I think as he was pausing, he was sort of thinking to himself, well, that's a good point. I hadn't really considered that. But I also take it to be, again, this notion of the press sort of leading him along to, okay, so you've laid out these positions, like, let's get to the point already. Let's erode whatever railings still exist to get to this agenda, because it's now or never. Who knows what's going to happen in 2022? Who knows what's going to happen in 2024? My other thought, though, and I tweeted something to this effect, was if the filibuster is a Jim Crow relic, isn't the Democrat Party sort of a Jim Crow relic too? Jim Crow laws came under the Democrat Party, so should we be abolishing the Democratic Party, President Biden? Obviously, he's not going to get that question, although he did put out the point when he was asked, are you going to run again in 2024? Why haven't you set up your campaign committee yet? He said, look, I don't even know if there's going to be a Republican Party in 2024. So maybe for symmetry, there should have been a question about, should we abolish the Democrat Party as well, Mr. President? But look, I do think that it's a legitimate question, but the context for the question is important. And it was Barack Obama who infused this narrative in the first place, because it was at John Lewis's funeral when he talked about it being a Jim Crow relic, even though I believe if you go back in the tapes, Obama has supported the filibuster in the past as well. I think what Biden was saying, I think he was sort of being relatively candid here, is, look, I have to do what's going to be politically tenable. I'm going to push as far as I can, as hard as I can, and we'll see where the chips fall. But he also did say later, look, if we essentially can't get these policies through, I am open to doing whatever it takes. And Axios also reported on this, that he had a meeting with historians recently, and he basically said, sure, I'm okay chucking the filibuster. So, it's good that the question was asked, but it goes to the woke narrative being treated as a legitimate one once again. And so I would say that's a negative thing from the journalistic perspective. And maybe it would have been good to say, look, the former leader of your party, your former boss, said it's a Jim Crow relic. But again, you're sort of conceding the point that this is a legitimate narrative. I don't think it's a legitimate narrative. But that said, yeah, this was one of the more telling exchanges and one of the more serious questions that he got during the press conference, which tells you all you need to know about the press conference.
Yeah, I think it was just really smart of Caitlin to sort of set it up this way, where you're saying, listen, you've said something ridiculous, which is that, I mean, she obviously didn't infuse it with that kind of commentary, but like, you've said something on this level that these voting laws, or the filibuster, is tantamount to Jim Crow. Okay, so she knew that he was going to say yes to that question. There's no way he's not going to say yes to that question. So you know that. Now you set him up to be like, well, okay, so then where do you not want to eliminate it? I just thought it was sort of a clever 1-2 punch there. But again, you make a really good point, which is that the journalists take for granted, like, they have just totally, Obama's point about the filibuster, which is an enormously important part of our government, is just been completely normalized to the point where there were not questions to the president of the United States about holding this wildly radical and insulting and insane position on the filibuster, right? That, like, they've all flip-flopped in the filibuster in the last 5 years because it's sort of fashionable in the woke culture to do so. And so you don't even have the reporter saying, we need another question, right? After that question, someone else come in and say, why on earth do you believe the filibuster is a relic of Jim Crow? Explain that. Like, force them to explain that. But again, this gets to the point. This is not just about them being a democratic propaganda machine. This is about them being totally in concert on leftist ideology. Like, they are leftists for the most part. It's not that there aren't some good journalists who pepper their ranks, but for the most part, these are leftist ideologues. And so when Barack Obama and people in sort of fashionable corridors of the media start making the argument that the filibuster is a relic of Jim Crow, this is what's going to happen. It's just totally normalizing.
And also, it's worth pointing out that it was the same thing when it comes to what the media calls voting rights. There was a question asked about Republican legislators working to restrict voting. And maybe you could make the case that that's what the legislation currently being looked at in any number of states around the country is about. Another way of saying it might be state legislatures are looking to put forth a raft of policies that ensure that the vote integrity is upheld, that legitimate votes are not ultimately diluted by illegitimate votes, that there's not the opportunity, for fraud and corruption and irregularity at the polls, which undermines confidence in the entire system. But they would never accept that perspective on things is a legitimate one. It's Republicans want to restrict voting, which goes back to Jim Crow. So it ties it all together from the left side. And I think so. It shows, once again, it's almost organic, and it's not even a conscious thing. They just believe these narratives are, and that's it. And that is the truth. So yes, they are essentially propagandists, but they also, I think, really have drank the Kool-Aid. And that's what's so dangerous. Yeah.
That's what's so dangerous. And that's why one of the books that I'm at the National Journalism Center today, and that's why one of the books I give the students is Coming Apart, because I think it's just so essential to understand the bubble that the sort of press lives in and how that affects the ideological coverage. Speaking of which, I'm going to put this really beautiful Jen Rubin column up on the screen here, Jennifer Rubin. And Ben, we're going to do what nobody should do, which is just criticize Jen Rubin, because at this point it's like, why even bother? She's so dishonest and sort of bad at being a commentator. But here we go. Biden should fact check the White House press corps. And Jen Rubin's complaint here is that the media fomented hysteria about the border crisis. And Biden didn't fact check them to say, per the monkey cage at Washington Post, the surge is actually just the seasonal increase. Ben, what do you make of Jen Rubin's reaction to the presser as she articulated it in this beautiful column?
That's the Washington Post House conservative reporter opinion person on display. I think that's the only way to describe it. I mean, she says in concluding her column, you mentioned that the media was injecting the false narrative about a Biden immigration surge. She also says their failure to ask about the pandemic, the recession, anti-Asian violence, climate change, or even infrastructure, Biden had to bring it up himself, was nothing short of irresponsible. They pleaded for news conferences and then showed themselves to be unserious. Then she says they never laid a glove on Biden. They did, however, make the case for why these events are an utter waste of the president's time. I mean, it's beyond Trump derangement syndrome with Jen Rubin. It's to the point of she's saying the press isn't left enough. It's really amazing to see the evolution of people like Rubin, but not just her. I mean, it's the Bill Kristols of the world. It's other people who in the past, could have been at least considered moderate conservatives, or, they were the leftists mugged by reality, but now they're just so far gone. And so it's amazing that you could actually have a critique from the Washington Post's person on the right that's to the left of where the press is. And maybe part of this is it's shifting the Overton window. It's, see, look, we got criticism. So now we need to go even more left with our questioning. But again, you're left to wonder, like, do they understand how beyond parody this is, that to sane, rational people, this is absurd? Or are they so deeply enmeshed in these echo chambers, like you said, to the coming apart point, that it's just a viciously perpetuating cycle that gets worse and worse? And I think it is, until and unless they're handed tons of electoral losses and the country completely repudiates the leftism. Why would they act any differently than they do? They're kind of dominating all the commanding heights right now. And I think what is ultimately this all about, a central tenet of my thinking about media and my writing on it, is that it's all about creating a monopoly on narrative, which leads to a monopoly on culture and a monopoly on politics. And so if you consider that all the media theater that we see around politics is about ultimately foisting these narratives on us, protecting the narratives, and we talk about a lot anti-speech activism from the press, it's all about ensuring that there is only one party line that exists and dominates. And you see that sort of meta issue informing all of the sorts of questions that the president was asked yesterday. And if this is what we're in for the next 4 years, it's really going to be sickening. It's going to make for a lot of bad news for us to break down and deconstruct, but it's going to be disastrous for, the press loves to talk about democracy and our republic and the like. It's going to be disastrous for it, because there will be no sort of fourth estate. It doesn't exist anymore. It's just an organ of the ruling class. And I think that was on full display yesterday.
I want to touch briefly on Jen Rubin just as an instructive example, not to sort of pick on Jen Rubin because she's just so disqualified and discredited that but she is sort of representative of something, because why does Jen Rubin, formerly conservative, write a column like this, literally criticizing the press from the left, arguing that they weren't left enough? And it's weird because it's like, when it's Jen Rubin, she's not criticizing the press from the left in the sort of Glenn Greenwald way that's like, you're corporatized and you're not asking about labor, et cetera, et cetera. She's criticizing them from like the woke perspective. She's saying the media was not woke enough. And so what's the motivation for Jennifer Rubin to do something like that? It's to sort of prove her bona fides, right, with this new coalition that she wants to fit in with, right? She used to be the conservative columnist at the Washington Post. So how do you ensure everybody that you are good? You're one of the good ones. You write something saying they didn't ask enough questions about climate justice. I mean, it's just like and so it's telling because that's her read of the situation. That's her read of sort of the media swamp here in DC. And so she's giving them what she wants. And what Jen Rubin thinks they want is a woke critique of the media from the left. And so that's always worth kind of thinking about when it comes to people like her who want sort of like former conservatives that now were so angered by Trump they want to please the left. They're going woke. Like they're not going Greenwald, they're going woke. And that's I just think that's a really important way to understand all of this. You're right. There's just going to be so much bad news. We're going to have these sort of continual balances where it's like the bulk of the questions are sort of friendly, nice bubble bath questions, and then you'll have that balance of tough questions that give them cover to say that they're doing a really good job here, and then grading Biden on a curve. So I think to your point, this is absolutely representative of what we're going to see for the next 3.5 years, whatever it is, maybe 8 years. We'll see. I don't know. I wonder how Kamala Harris reacted to Biden's potential admission that he's already thinking about re-election. Who knows? But Ben, you're so right that we're in for a lot more bad news.
This is what state media looks like. And like you said, the purportedly tougher questions are going to create an imprimatur of legitimacy or a facade of legitimacy that enables all of the insanity and covering and water carrying for the administration. I really think the way the press ought to be looked at, they have earned this expectation, is they exist to create an aura of legitimacy around our ruling class. And so they ought to be thought of as the PR people for the administration. But because they are press, and so there's a seeming distinction, at least on its face, between the press and the people that they're covering, it provides this legitimacy that makes it seem as if they're a step removed, when in reality, they're all on the same team. And so you have to ask a couple tough questions or substantive questions here or there to create the appearance of legitimacy, but everyone knows that it's really a charade. And I think that's just how you have to look at it. And it has to be assumed that that's the case. They have earned that reputation justly and richly. And look, again, it's good that they're so brazen in it to some extent. It's good that Jen Rubin is as pathetic in a column like that as she was, because it just shows you that they're so mired in their ideology and their devotion and lust for power that they've dropped all pretenses. So I guess kudos for the transparency, but it just means awful news for the country. We might have to revise the title at some point, although it doesn't have the same play on words if it's awful news.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, here's someone who just commented, I thought maybe I'd stumbled across a possibly fresh new viewpoints. You guys are talking as if echo chambers are only a problem on one side. So much for fresh new viewpoints. I would actually really like to take a moment to respond to that, because of course both sides have echo chambers. There's no way to sort of dispute that. But the important thing is one side's echo chamber, and that's why we exist and why we're doing what we're doing. One side's echo chamber is considered the echo chamber, right? Like that's considered the mainstream. They have control. Their echo chamber is the entire media structure. It is the corporate media structure that controls the narrative in this country. And it's actually just the leftist echo chamber. So no, there's no reason to deny that there are echo chambers on both sides. But I wanted to respond to that point to Jim Hathaway. And thank you for commenting, Jim. But that's, I think, a really, really important point to raise. Of course, both sides have their echo chambers. It just so happens that in this country, the left's echo chamber is the dominant this is the dominant media infrastructure. They have control over the narrative. And that's why we're here to bring you the bad news of that and how it sort of trickles down into the daily news cycle. And that's what we're going to do. It's what we're going to do for the next 4 years. And when we have occasion to criticize the right, I'm sure that Ben and I will be eager to do that as well, because there are certainly occasions to do that. So we will be here for all of it. And we just appreciate everybody watching. We really think that this is an important thing to have from the right, because I love Ben's point that they sort of, and the one thing I want to end on is that Ben is right. These sort of performative questions do legitimize the corruption of the ruling class. They allow them to sort of distract from it and enable it and say, listen, we are asking these tough questions. But the point I want to make is that I don't think it's intentional, because I don't think they even know. It's like, does a fish know that it's wet? Right. I genuinely don't think, and this to the coming apart point, I don't think that they realize that. I don't think they realize exactly how bad they are. So anyway, Ben, any final thoughts here?
Yeah, you knock that question out of the park on echo chambers. I look forward to the day when the overwhelming, dominating echo chamber that controls all the commanding heights is a conservative echo chamber. I'm pretty confident we're never going to see that in our lifetimes, or children's lifetimes, or children's lifetimes. But let's see. And it's also worth pointing out, the reason that I emphasize ruling class instead of Democrat is that it is bipartisan. The political establishment is all in on the same game, and they pretty much do conform to the same prevailing narratives when it comes to immigration or climate change or national security and foreign policy. On any number of these issues, look at the Senate, look at the makeup of the Senate. What percentage of senators typically really side with where the conservative base is? It's maybe a rotating cast of 5 to at most 10 people in the Senate. So we're talking the representatives, 5% of the country. Is that the only percentage that's conservatives, or 10% at the best? No, it's not representative of the country. That's because our ruling class is not representative of the country, but it all does really conform to the same sorts of prevailing narratives on all these issues. So that's why I would emphasize, look, we're attacking an echo chamber that's representative of a bipartisan ruling class, and it justly deserves the critiques that we give it. So that's all I've got for bad news this week. I can't do anymore.
Can't do it anymore. Well, that's why we just talked about Jen Rubin. It is truly bipartisan. But we'll be back soon with more. Please subscribe. Again, we think these discussions are really important. We think it's something that conservatives deserve, as media criticism from a conservative perspective. So we'll be back. We're back here on Wednesdays. I'll at least be back in my normal studio next week, Wednesdays and Fridays, brought to you by the Federalist, by the National Journalism Center. Until then, I'm Emily Jashinsky.
And I'm Ben Weingarten.
Thanks so much.